Berlin, May 1945. The war is ending, but the death does not stop. Concrete dust floats like ash in the morning air. Buildings that once held families now stand as hollow skeletons, their walls torn open by fire and explosives. Somewhere beneath the rubble, a radio crackles a broken broadcast, the last breath of a city that once ruled a continent. A lone woman walks the shattered street, clutching the small hand of a child who has already seen more destruction than soldiers of the last war. Her feet step over bricks, glass, and the twisted metal of a collapsed tram line. No one looks up anymore. The sky has rained fire for too long. Less than 30 years earlier, Europe fought what was called the War to End All Wars. It claimed nearly 20 million lives, a number so large it felt impossible to exceed. But World War II did not just surpass that number. It multiplied it. Again and again. More nations, more weapons, more civilians. A conflict designed not only to defeat armies, but to annihilate entire peoples. A world once wounded, now nearly bled dry. The First World War ended with silence no one trusted. Armistice Day, November 11th, 1918, guns stopped firing, men crawled out of trenches, and nations stared at one another through a fog of suspicion and grief. Europe was broken. 10 million soldiers lay dead. Empires crumbled. The German Kaiser fled, the Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved, and the Ottoman Empire neared its end. The world promised never again. Treaties were drawn, borders redrawn. A League of Nations formed to keep the peace. But the peace was built on shaky ground. Anger, humiliation, and economic devastation. Germany carried the heaviest weight. The Treaty of Versailles forced it to disarm, surrender territory, and pay reparations so immense that they strangled its economy. Factories closed, inflation spiraled, middle-class families watched life savings disappear overnight. Hunger became political fuel. Into the chaos came voices offering simple answers. Voices that pointed blame at foreigners, at minorities, at the very system meant to prevent another war. This was not just Germany's story. Communism surged in Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution. Italy turned to fascism under Mussolini. Japan, starved of natural resources, eyed expansion into Asia. Nationalism, the force many blamed for WWI, grew stronger, not weaker. Around the world, militaries rebuilt quietly. Technology advanced rapidly in peace, but the lessons learned in trenches and artillery barrages followed. Engineers refined tanks, aircraft, machine guns. The next war, if it came, would not be fought slowly in muddy ditches. It would move fast. It would strike deep. And it would not stay contained. World War I was largely a European tragedy. World War II would circle the globe, from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Burma, to the icy crossroads of Stalingrad, to the burning skis over Tokyo. Meanwhile, politics poisoned the atmosphere. Dictators tested the world's resolve. Japan seized Manchuria in 1931. Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935. Germany marched into the Rhineland in 1936, then Austria, then Czechoslovakia. The League of Nations protested, but did little else. The world hesitated, still traumatized by the last war's losses. Appeasement became strategy. Avoiding war was more important than stopping one. But in trying to avoid conflict, leaders allowed a much larger one to form. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, unleashing a new kind of warfare, blitzkrieg. Fast, mechanized, overwhelming. Cities fell in days instead of months. Millions of civilians instantly became targets. Refugees on roads were bombed from above. Radio signals replaced messenger runners. Tanks pushed where horses once stalled. The transformation was shocking. World War I killed many, but slowly by attrition. World War II would kill faster, with efficiency. And it was only the beginning. By the end of 1939, Europe was once again at war. By 1941, the United States and Soviet Union would join, turning a regional conflict into the deadliest global showdown in human history. The scale was expanding, and so was the capability to kill. But the full story of why World War II became so deadly lies deeper, in the massive mobilization of entire societies, and in strategies that blurred the line between soldier and civilian. By the early 1940s, the world was no longer divided into armies and observers. Everyone was involved. Everyone could die. World War I mobilized millions of soldiers. World War II mobilized entire nations. Factories no longer produced goods for daily life, they became engines of war. Women replaced men on assembly lines, forging rifles, bullets, tanks, and aircraft in never-ending shifts. Children collected scrap metal. Farmers supplied armies larger than anything history had seen. Warfare shifted from professional soldiers to total war, where every citizen's effort and every citizen's survival became part of the fight. The numbers alone reveal the terrifying difference. WWI, million soldiers mobilized. WWII, over 110 million under arms. WWI casualties, tilde 20 million total. WWII fatalities, 70-85 million plus. The battlefield expanded from the trenches of Europe to 6 continents and every major ocean. Battles raged in deserts, jungles, cities, mountains, frozen plains, remote islands, and strategic waterways. And technology raced ahead even faster. In WWI, pilots fired pistols from rickety canvas biplanes. In WWII, fleets of metal aircraft carried bombs that could erase a city block in seconds. Chemistry gave birth to new explosives. Physics brought radar and advanced ballistics. Industrial production meant weapons were not just deadly, they were abundant. Germany built over 40,000 combat aircraft. The United States built nearly 300,000. The Soviet Union produced tanks by the tens of thousands, even while their factories were relocated deep into the Ural Mountains, far from German reach. The skis transformed warfare. Strategic bombing campaigns targeted factories, rail lines, and often the millions of civilians living around them. London burned under the Blitz. Hamburg was consumed in a firestorm. Tokyo would later become a sea of flames. Unlike WWI, where trenches shielded the vast majority of civilians, WWII made homes, schools, and hospitals primary targets. At sea, submarines cut supply lifelines and sent thousands of merchant sailors to watery grave without warning. Naval battles spanned the Atlantic and Pacific, sinking ships the size of skyscrapers. Yet the deadliest transformation was ideological. This war was not only about defeating an enemy army. It was about erasing entire populations. Nazi Germany pursued racial conquest in Eastern Europe, declaring millions of Slavs, Jews, and others unworthy of life. The Holocaust industrialized death with gas chambers, crematoria, and mass shootings, turning genocide into a system. Japan's Imperial Army carried out brutal campaigns in China and Southeast Asia, from the rape of Nanjing to lethal experiments in biological warfare. These were not side effects of war. They were objectives. The brutality fed upon itself. The stakes grew higher with every lost battle and every occupied town. And so nations escalated even further, each determined to avoid the humiliation and stalemate of the last war. The military strategies that once focused on front lines now aim to break the enemy, will by destroying their people, their cities, and their hope. A world that had sworn never again just 2 decades earlier was now plunging into something far worse. The question was no longer whether war could be contained. It was how far humanity was willing to go. The forces were in place, the weapons were ready, the ideologies were uncompromising. And the killing was about to reach levels no one had imagined possible. From here, the reasons for World War II's unparalleled death toll become clear when we break the conflict into its most brutal angles. World War I introduced tanks and machine guns. World War II perfected them. Blitzkrieg, the German doctrine of rapid mechanized warfare, unleashed armored divisions supported by aircraft and mobile infantry. Instead of months of trench fighting, nations fell in days. Poland collapsed in 5 weeks. France, once confident behind its Maginot Line, surrendered in just 6. Armored vehicles rolled through countryside and cities alike. Artillery became mobile, reaching farther than ever before. Automatic weapons could mow down hundreds in minutes. Assault rifles, such as the German St. G44, redefined infantry firepower. War became fast. War became unstoppable. Fleeing civilians, once safe behind front lines, were now overtaken almost instantly. Roads clogged with refugees became open targets for strafing aircraft, multiplying the civilian death toll. Mechanization didn't just kill more soldiers, it expanded the battlefield to everyone in the way. The greatest change between the world wars was in the air. WWI aviation was limited, reconnaissance, occasional dogfights, small bombs dropped by hand. WWI gave birth to strategic bombing, where fleets of hundreds of heavy bombers turned cities into flaming craters. London, Rotterdam, Warsaw, Hamburg, Dresden, Tokyo. The list grows endlessly. Aircraft like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the Lancaster carried payloads that could flatten entire neighborhoods. German Stuka dive bombers shattered morale with their screaming sirens. Firebombing created tornadoes of heat, temperatures soaring above 1,000 degrees C, ripping oxygen from bomb shelters and suffocating survivors. Warfare no longer ended when a soldier returned home. The home became the battlefield. Millions who never held a rifle died in their own living rooms, victims of a war brought to their rooftops. In WWI, most civilians died from hunger, disease, and collateral damage. In WWI, civilians were deliberately targeted by both Axis and Allies. German occupation brought mass executions and hostage killings. Soviet offensives came with waves of revenge, displacing millions. Japanese forces ravaged cities across China and Southeast Asia, where torture, forced labor, and sexual slavery became instruments of control. The rape of Nanjing alone killed more than 200,000 civilians in weeks. Strategic decisions turned entire populations into military objectives. Destroy workforce, right arrow stop factory output. Burn farmland, starve armies and civilians alike. Bomb cultural centers, right arrow crush identity and resistance. Fear became a weapon. Genocide became policy. By viewing civilians not as non-combatants, but as resources to be exploited or erased, WWII erased one of humanity's oldest boundaries in war. And this was only half of the story. Because the deadliest reasons were yet to come, reasons rooted not just in technology, but in ideology. The Holocaust was not a byproduct of war. It was an objective, planned, structured, and industrialized. Nazi Germany pursued a racial vision in which millions were marked for elimination. Jews, Slavs, Roma, disabled persons, entire communities were condemned as subhuman. Death became a logistical operation. Deportation by rail. Separation by labor value. Gas chambers for rapid execution. Crematoria for concealment. Mass grave for efficiency. 6 million Jews murdered. Millions more perished in shootings, starvation, and forced labor. Elsewhere, Japan's imperial army committed mass atrocities in Asia. The rape of Nanjing, Unit 731's biological experiments, and systematic targeting of civilians showed a belief that conquest justified annihilation. This was war without moral limits. Death was not an accident, it was the mission. Between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union lay the deadliest land war ever fought. The Eastern Front consumed lives at a pace unimaginable in WWI. Over 30 million people died there alone. Cities like Stalingrad became battlegrounds where soldiers fought room to room, floor to floor. Civilians starved or froze beside unburied corpses. Prisoners captured by either side often faced execution rather than captivity. Hitler called it a war of annihilation. Stalin responded with orders that forbade retreat, not one step back. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed. Kiev, 1941, 600,000 Soviet troops lost. Vyazma and Bryansk, over 700,000 captured. Siege of Leningrad, 1 million civilians dead from hunger and shelling. WWI's front stalled. WWII's Eastern Front devoured. There was no mercy, only escalation. Across the Pacific, American forces confronted a new kind of resistance, entrenched defenders who preferred death to surrender. Japanese soldiers fortified caves, bunkers, and mountains. Each island became a fortress. Battles like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa saw casualty rates that shocked Allied commanders. At Iwo Jima, nearly every Japanese defender died. At Okinawa, civilians were driven to mass suicide, told that the enemy would torture them if they lived. Kamikaze attacks added terror to the seas, pilots turning their own bodies into weapons, crashing explosive-laden aircraft into Allied ships. Over 3,000 kamikaze strikes sent thousands of sailors to the bottom of the ocean. This mindset meant every battle ended in extremes. Few prisoners, many dead. And with the planned invasion of Japan looming, projections estimated more than 1 million Allied casualties and potentially far more Japanese if the fighting continued. Technology accelerated death. Ideology justified it. Battles stretched farther than ever. And the entire world was forced to take part. All of it was building toward a horrifying peak, a moment when war would cross the final threshold of destruction. By 1942, the war had reached a terrifying momentum. It was no longer a series of battles. It was a global machine of death, accelerating with each engagement. In the East, Stalingrad became the crucible of human endurance. August 23, 1942, the German Sixth Army advanced into the city, confident in mechanized superiority. Tanks rolled through shattered streets, while artillery turned entire neighborhoods into rubble. Civilians were caught between machine guns and rubble, trapped as buildings collapsed around them. Soviet resistance was unyielding. Snipers picked off officers. Soviet engineers rigged collapsing buildings as traps. Food was scarce. Winter approached, and neither side expected mercy. By February 2, 1943, the Sixth Army surrendered, over 91,000 soldiers captured, many of whom would die in captivity. Tens of thousands of civilians had already perished. Meanwhile, the war in the Pacific escalated with similar ferocity. In the Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal became a swamp of blood and disease. American and Japanese forces fought for months in jungle heat, mosquitoes carrying malaria as a silent killer alongside bullets. Naval battles like Savo Island claimed hundreds of ships and thousands of lives in a single night. Death was everywhere, above, below, on land, and in water. In North Africa, the deserts became a testing ground for mobility and mechanized warfare. Rommel's Africa Corps clashed with the British Eighth Army in a deadly game of maneuver. Sandstorms swallowed convoys. Tank columns annihilated infantry positions before supply lines could be reinforced. Casualties mounted, but the desert's vastness meant entire populations were indirectly affected. Civilians displaced, villages destroyed, trade halted. Europe's skis carried yet another horror. Strategic bombing had evolved from intimidation into systematic annihilation. RAF and USAAF bombers targeted German cities with incendiaries, creating firestorms in Hamburg, Dresden, and Berlin. In 1943 alone, over 100,000 civilians perished in German cities due to aerial bombardment. The lines between soldiers and civilians had blurred completely. The Eastern Front remained relentless. Operation Uranus, the Soviet counter-offensive at Stalingrad, demonstrated a new scale of operational planning. Encirclement strategies trapped hundreds of thousands of Axis troops. Entire divisions were annihilated, leaving nothing but frozen corpses in the snow. Winter cold became as deadly as bullets. At the same time, Japan's expansion into Southeast Asia brought mass starvation and disease. Occupation policies disrupted local agriculture and forced labor conscripted millions. Prisoners of war were executed or worked to death. Civilians in Burma, the Philippines, and China were caught in a spiral of violence that mirrored Europe's worst atrocities. By late 1943, the death toll had reached levels that historians could scarcely imagine. Eastern Front, over 10 million military deaths. Asia Pacific, over 5 million military deaths, millions of civilians. Western Europe, hundreds of thousands in bombings and battles. The war's machinery had reached an efficiency and cruelty far beyond WWI. Where once soldiers died in attrition over months, millions now perished in weeks, sometimes hours, as mechanized warfare, ideology, and civilian targeting converged. And yet the deadliest escalation, the final push into annihilation, had not yet arrived. The industrialized killing, the genocides, the air raids, and the fanatic combat of the Pacific were building toward 1944-1945, a period that would show the world the true scale of death that modern warfare could deliver. By 1944, the war had become a planet-wide inferno, consuming everything in its path. In Europe, the Allies prepared Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of soldiers, and hundreds of aircraft descended on the beaches of northern France. Machine gun fire, artillery, and landmines greeted them. In a single day, over 10,000 Allied casualties occurred. The beaches were littered with men, blood, and shattered vehicles. Simultaneously, the Eastern Front reached new heights of horror. Operation Bagration, launched by the Soviets in June 1944, annihilated the German Army Group Center. Over 400,000 German troops were killed, wounded, or captured. Cities were obliterated, villages burned, and countless civilians caught in the crossfire. The scale and speed of destruction eclipsed anything seen in WWI. Entire armies ceased to exist overnight. Strategic bombing intensified. Dresden, February 1945, became a furnace of fire and smoke. Over 25,000 civilians died in a matter of days as Allied bombers unleashed incendiary raids, reducing the historic city to ashes. Hamburg, Berlin, and other cities faced similar fates. The skis had become weapons of mass destruction, not of a single army, but of entire nations. Across the Pacific, battles reached apocalyptic extremes. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the Philippines saw soldiers fight to the death in caves, tunnels, and cliffs. Kamikaze pilots crashed into fleets, sending thousands of sailors to their grave. Civilians on islands were coerced into suicide, coerced by propaganda and fear. Hunger, disease, and combat merged into a single, lethal force. Then came the ultimate demonstration of human-engineered death, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. August 6 and 9, 1945. Atomic bombs leveled entire cities in seconds. Tens of thousands died instantly. Tens of thousands more perished in the following weeks from radiation, burns, and trauma. Civilization had entered a new era, one where a single weapon could erase an entire population center in moments. By the war's end, the human toll was staggering. Military deaths, 25-30 million. Civilian deaths, million. Total fatalities, 70-85 million, more than 3 times the total of WWI. Disease, famine, and displacement added millions more to the suffering. Infrastructure, culture, and governance were obliterated in countless regions. Cities, villages, forests, and oceans had become theaters of relentless death. World War II had achieved a level of lethality unimaginable just 2 decades earlier. Where once battles were constrained by lines and trenches, now war consumed entire societies. Soldiers, civilians, children, and the elderly all were caught in a storm of mechanized, ideological, and strategic annihilation. The war's end revealed a world scarred far beyond Europe's trenches. The methods, weapons, and mindset that created this catastrophe would shape the decades to come, and the full consequences would ripple through history, society, and conscience. The guns fell silent in 1945, but the echoes of death reverberated across continents. Europe lay in ruins. Cities like Dresden, Warsaw, and Berlin were unrecognizable, skeletons of stone and steel. Streets once bustling with life were now filled with rubble, shattered vehicles, and corpses hastily buried or left exposed. Germany had lost nearly 7 million soldiers, with millions more wounded or missing. The civilian population had suffered unimaginable losses. Over 6 million perished in bombings, forced labor, and famine. Families were shattered. Children wandered homeless, scavenging among ruins for scraps of food. Disease, malnutrition, and exposure claimed thousands more even after the fighting ended. In the Soviet Union, the toll was staggering. Over 20 million deaths, a combination of soldiers and civilians. Entire towns had been leveled on the Eastern Front, and villages burned as both German and Soviet forces waged total war. Survivors faced famine, harsh winters, and a devastated infrastructure that made basic survival a daily battle. Japan's cities bore the brunt of firebombing campaigns and ultimately atomic devastation. Tokyo's firestorm in March 1945 killed over 100,000 civilians, while Hiroshima and Nagasaki each claimed tens of thousands immediately, with countless more succumbing to radiation in the weeks that followed. Millions were displaced, with entire neighborhoods wiped off the map. The Allies had faced staggering losses as well. The United States suffered over 400,000 military deaths, Britain nearly 380,000, and France, Poland, and other nations combined into the millions. Soldiers returned home physically scarred, psychologically shattered, and bearing the memories of horrors that few could ever describe. Post-traumatic stress was widespread, though it would take decades for society to recognize it fully. Prisoners of war, from the Eastern Front to the Pacific, experienced death even after surrender. German soldiers captured by the Soviets often faced brutal camps where survival was uncertain. Japanese POWs endured starvation and disease under Allied custody. In every theater, captivity carried a high risk of death. Economies were shattered. Factories, railways, ports, and mines, the lifelines of national survival, lay in ruins. Food shortages became immediate post-war crises. Starvation threatened millions, particularly in Eastern Europe and parts of Asia. Relief efforts struggled to reach displaced populations, with transportation networks decimated by years of bombing and combat. Societies faced moral and cultural devastation. Holocaust survivors emerged from concentration camps physically emaciated and emotionally traumatized. Families had been erased. Communities were obliterated. In Asia, the memories of massacres and brutal occupation left enduring scars. Cities, cultural landmarks, and centuries of history had vanished in a matter of months. Yet even amid the devastation, nations began to reckon with the scale of human loss. Statistical tallies, while incomplete, revealed numbers beyond comprehension, tens of millions dead, and many more permanently injured or psychologically affected. The world now understood that modern warfare could annihilate entire populations, and the moral and strategic boundaries of war had shifted irrevocably. The aftermath was not merely numerical. The psychological weight of total war, a conflict that spared no one, became a permanent aspect of global consciousness. The sheer scope of civilian targeting, mass bombings, and industrialized genocide forced nations to reconsider how wars were fought and whether humanity could endure such destruction again. As the smoke cleared, the political map of the world had been redrawn. Germany was divided and occupied. The Nuremberg trials began in late 1945, holding Nazi leaders accountable for crimes against humanity. For the first time in history, genocide and systematic atrocities were codified as prosecutable offenses. The world confronted a grim truth. The scale of human cruelty could be organized, industrialized, and rationalized. In Japan, the Allied occupation, led by General MacArthur, implemented reforms that dismantled militarism and sought to rebuild society. Yet the trauma of firebombing and atomic attacks lingered, leaving survivors grappling with physical and emotional scars. Cities were in ruins, and millions of civilians struggled to find food, shelter, and stability. Globally, the war had forced unprecedented population displacement. Millions of refugees roamed Europe and Asia, unable to return to destroyed homes or communities. Borders shifted overnight, creating stateless populations. Families were fractured, cultural identities challenged, and economies overwhelmed by the sheer number of people in need. The Cold War emerged from the ashes of WWII as the United States and the Soviet Union, the two surviving superpowers, prepared for a confrontation that would last decades. Nuclear weapons, first demonstrated at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, became symbols of a terrifying new era. Humanity had glimpsed annihilation on a scale never before possible, and governments now planned global strategies to prevent yet another total war. Socially, the war forced nations to rethink gender roles, labor, and civil rights. Women had run factories and contributed directly to the war effort. Soldiers returned home, but millions of widows and orphans remained. Entire societies faced the challenge of rebuilding morale, infrastructure, and governance. The human cost remained staggering. Europe, 40–50 million deaths, military and civilian combined. Asia, 20–30 million deaths. Global total, 70–85 million fatalities. World War II left a scar on humanity that no treaty, monument, or history book can fully capture. The scale of death, destruction, and suffering was unprecedented, a grim reminder of how modern technology, ideology, and ambition can combine to devastate the world. Where World War I had relied on attrition and static battle lines, WWII embraced speed, scale, and total mobilization. Entire cities became battlefields, civilians became targets, and ideological fervor justified atrocities that defied comprehension. The mechanization of killing, combined with a global theater of conflict, created a lethality that the world had never experienced, and hopefully never would again. Yet amid the horror, there were lessons. Humanity witnessed the consequences of unbridled ambition, fanaticism, and technological escalation. Institutions like the United Nations emerged to prevent such a catastrophe from recurring. The Nuremberg trials codified international law against genocide and war crimes, acknowledging that some acts were beyond justification. The shadow of WWII persists even today. Nuclear weapons, mass-produced military technology, and the potential for total war remain warnings that the past must not be forgotten. The war reshaped not only borders, economies, and governments, but also morality, strategy, and the very concept of human responsibility. Above all, the story of World War II reminds us that death on a global scale is not inevitable, but preventable. If history is studied, lessons are learned, and humanity values life over ideology and destruction. From the rubble of cities to the memory of those lost, the world learned that war's deadliest face comes not only from armies and weapons, but from the choices that lead societies to embrace annihilation. In the end, the deadliness of World War II was a mirror held up to humanity, a reflection of what can happen when technology, ideology, and ambition collide without restraint. And it is a call for vigilance, to honor the lives lost, to remember the consequences of unchecked power, and to ensure that the world never again approaches such unimaginable destruction.